Welcome back to Kim Reads, and we continue with Phantom. Etienne was right about the exorcism. It was one thing I never should have permitted. If Erik was not possessed before the ceremony took place, he certainly behaved as though he wanted was over. His respectful attachment to the priest was gone for good. He refused to continue the vocal training that had given him both such delight. But worse than that, he refused to hear Mass or to have a crucifix in his bedroom. I did not dare to insist, for he had begun to behave so strangely that I found myself growing truly afraid of him. Curious things began to happen in my house when he was near. Articles disappeared, almost before my very eyes, only to return again once I ceased to search for them. I knew he was responsible, but when I challenged him, he only shrugged and laughed and told me we must have a ghost. Then one day, when I had a cup left from a saucer and smashed itself in the grate, I discovered a finely hair length of thread attached to the broken handle, and I turned him on with fury. "You did that, didn't you? You made it happen." No, he backed away with me from some of the fear. "How could I have done that? I wasn't even near it. It was the ghost." "There is no ghost," I shouted. "There is no ghost. Only you with your infernal threads of silk. Look out, you haven't been so clever this time, haven't you? This is the one trick I can see straight through." He was silent, glaring at the gossamer thread as though his own incompetence angered him. I could almost hear his furious determination that the next time there would be nothing to betray his hand. "There will not be a next time," I said calmly, and I saw his head jerk up in alarm that I should have read his thoughts with such ease. "This wickedness is to cease right away. Do you hear me?" "It isn't me," he repeated with childish stubbornness. "It's the ghost that Father Manzart tried to send away." I shook him wildly by the shoulders until the mask dislodged itself from the floor and fell between us. "Stop this madness," I shrieked. "Stop it at once. If you don't, I shall do what Dr. Barrier advises and send you to the terrible place for mad people." "Yes, that frightens you, doesn't it? Well, I'm glad it frightens you, because perhaps now it will make you stop this insane behavior. I promise you, Erik, if I send you away in a asylum, you will never come back. Never. They will tie your hands behind your back and shut you away in a dark place until you die, and you will never ever see me again. How will you stop? Will you?" I let him go abruptly and stood back, panting for breath, while he knelt on the carpet at my feet and replaced the mask hastily with shaking hands. I could feel his terror. It was like a physical force, but for once I felt no guilt or remorse at my harshness. The two of us were approaching a dangerous precipice, and I knew that if I did not take control of him now, we would both finish in an asylum. "What would you do?" he whispered softly, not looking at me, "if I were no longer here?" "I would marry Dr. Barrier," I said, goaded to the lie by sheer desperation. "He has already asked me, and you are all that prevents the marriage from taking place. So you see, you had better take care and do as I say. Now look at me, and promise there will be no more of these happenings." He continued to kneel on the floor, winding the thread of silk tightly around one skeleton finger until the white tip turned blue where he had cut off the circulation of blood. "Erik," quick as a grasshopper, he leapt out of reach from my hand and ran to the door, where he paused to look back at me defiantly. "There is a ghost," he told me steadily. "There is a ghost here, Mother. It's going to stay with you forever and ever." I stood looking after him, one hand against my throat, the other outreached to him in a hopeless gesture of supplication. I suddenly felt very cold. That night I heard the voice for the first time, a voice that was familiar yet strangely altered, singing so low and soft that at first I was barely aware of its sweet, hypnotic tone. The voice was close beside me, so close that it seemed if I stretched out a hand I would surely have touched it. But as I stood up curiously and moved toward it, the voice retreated before me. I stopped and stared at Erik, who was grooming Sasha on the mat before the fire. He seemed absorbed in the task and quite unaware of my agitation. The voice was muted, a distant, eerie breath which seemed to beckon me out of the room and up the staircase. I followed with helpless fascination As I entered the bedroom, the wordless melody seemed to gather strength and center itself upon the statue of the shepherd boy which stood in my marble-top chest of drawers. I drew closer, and now it was unmistakably clear to me that the statue itself was responsible for the humming. I gazed at it in the amazement, and as I did so, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the room. Erik was suddenly beside me, watching me watch the statue. He had removed the mask and had his lips were set in a grim line of silence. And then I knew. I drew back my hand very slowly and deliberately, letting him see my intent. But he did not even blink, and the soft, seductive hymn never faltered. When I struck him across the mouth, it seemed to me that the statue cried out in pain. I understand now that he had employed those long, dismal hours of solitude. I recognized the new achievement that he had added to his curious misarray of talents. I remember the present which Marie had brought him for his 5th birthday, a present which had remained unopened and which I had later locked away in my bureau as so totally unsuitable. An antique copy of La Ventriloquie ou les Astronomies. I thought it would interest him, she had explained when I took her task for stupidity. I only wanted to amuse him, but if you think it would be best that he should not have it, then of course you must keep it from him. I should have known nothing could be kept from Erik once his curiosity was aroused. How could I have been stupid enough to think that he would not remember the only birthday present he ever received, or that a simple lock would be sufficient to keep him out of my bureau? The book was never missing whenever I had caused to open the cabinet, but of course he was too clever and too secretive to have made a mistake as elementary as that. If he wished to keep something to himself, there was no one more adroit at covering his own tracks than his curious child, part cat, part fox, part nightingale. The shepherd boy continued to sing to me, and though I understood the secret of this illusion, I found myself compelled to listen to its haunting beauty. At first, I listened against my will, swearing each time that I would destroy the wretched figure as soon as it was silent. On several occasions, I lifted my hand to dash it to the floor, but each time I was restrained by some unseen force which seemed to emanate from deep inside my body. And then, little by little, I began to abandon my senses to its growing power. I became unable to distinguish between illusion and reality. The voice not only sang now, it talked, and I soon found myself acceding to its numerous little requests. I humored it when he told me it was cold by the window and moved it to the table by my bed. When I sulked like a child and told me it would not sing unless I kissed it, I bent obediently and laid my lips against its cool, lifeless cheek. There was indeed a ghost now, but its spirit was beyond the power of exorcism, and I embraced its presence with wondering delight. Slowly I was crossing the enticing bridge that had been opened up before me, following a magic rainbow which beckoned me ever farther into a dangerous and unknown land. How much of it was a dream, the product of the long repressed emotions, and how much was due to Erik, I cannot say. I was drawn willingly in the quicksand of this growing fantasy. It seemed that physically we drew even farther apart during this time, meeting only in the strange spiritual oasis of sound. I scarcely saw him, but when I did, he was very restrained and civil, almost quaintly adult in his manner towards me. And as he grew older and more fiercely independent before my very eyes, it seemed to me that the voice of the figure grew correspondingly younger, more petulant and demanding with every day that passed. Increasingly, it seemed to punish me, first with stubborn silence and then with tears, and soon my head rang in the night with the persistent, heart-trending cry of an inconsolable baby. I could not eat or sleep. Night after night, I walked into my room in despair, cradling the statue against my breast, until at last it lay beside me on my bed, silenced only by the touch of my hand. I spiraled farther and farther down in this dark dream until the dominance of this cold porcelain tyrant began to touch every aspect of my life. I no longer went to Mass and refused to see Father Manzer when he came to the house. When Etienne remarked upon my parlor and my distracted air, we quarreled violently. "What's the matter with you, Madeleine?" he demanded uncertainly. "You're like a hunted fox, staring over your shoulder all the time. What are you listening to?" "Nothing," I said sharply. "I'm not listening for anything." But even as I lay in his arms in a house on the far side of the village, the sound of crying still filled my ears, made me too restless and agitated to respond to his caress. At length, rebuffed and disturbed by my coldness, he sat up and looked at me with irritation. "If you do not wish to be touched, I would prefer you to tell me and have done with it. There really seems to be no purpose in prolonging an exercise in mutual frustration." I got up like a sleepwalker and went to the door. Etienne ran after me, and when I looked after him, I could see anger and concern marring on his face. "Tell me what's wrong," he demanded. I shook my head. "I have to go," I said weakly. "I should not be here. I've left him crying." Etienne frowned. Etienne frowned slightly. "Erik?" I turned to him impatiently. Why on earth should he think I was talking about Erik when it was the baby who cried? I had opened my mouth to tell him this, but when I suddenly remembered the dreadful word asylum and Etienne's brisk, uncompromising sense of logic. If I told him, he'd think I was mad. "I don't understand," he persisted, reaching out for me. I avoided his grasp with an urgency that was suddenly very close to fear. All I wanted now was to get out of the house as quickly as possible. "Madeleine," he cornered me by the door, and his grip on my wrist seemed like a jailer's. I began to struggle wildly. "Let me go," I shouted. "I will not be treated like a specimen for the observation of School of Medicine." He let go of me in astonishment, and I wrenched open the door. "For pity's sake, Madeleine, let's discuss this calmly. I don't want to discuss anything. I don't want to see you, Etienne. Ever." I saw the pain and bewilderment on his face. For once he had no words, no nice, neat, empirical solution to offer. Science and logic had failed him in the face of my devastating unreason. "I can't believe you mean that," he said with disbelief. "What has happened to you, Madeleine? What has happened to make you turn from me like this?" "Nothing has happened," I told him distantly. "I must go." "You can't go. Not like this. Madeleine!" He caught my attention once more. While I only stared at him unseeingly, as the sound of crying swelled in an unbearable crescendo inside my head. I might have been looking at a total stranger. His words were empty mouthings that had lost their power to move me, unless I saw him drop helplessly back to his side. He made no further attempt to stop me leaving, and as I left his house, I was unaware that he would be too proud to seek me out against my spoken wish. A few months ago, the prospect of his indifference would have broken my heart. Now I welcomed it with relief. One by one, I was closing the windows that looked out in the world beyond my prison, retreating behind the strange barricade that Erik was patiently erecting around me. The day that I walked away from Etienne was the day that I finally turned my back on reality and locked the door. Thanks for listening.